The desert wind howled across the barren landscape of Afghanistan, carrying with it the scent of dust and diesel fuel. Navy SEAL Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez crouched behind a crumbling wall, his weathered hands gripping his rifle as explosions echoed in the distance. At 28, he had already seen more combat than most soldiers would in a lifetime, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to unfold. The mission seemed routine enough when briefed back at the forward operating base. Intelligence had located a high-value target in a remote village, nestled between two rocky hills. The Taliban commander they were hunting had been responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces, and taking him out would save countless lives. Rodriguez and his 6-man team had conducted dozens of similar operations, slipping in under cover of darkness, neutralizing the threat, and extracting before dawn. But this time was different. As their helicopter touched down in the landing zone 3 kilometers from the village, Rodriguez felt an unusual tension in the air. The local informant who had provided the intelligence seemed nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder as he pointed toward the target building. Team leader Lieutenant Jake Harrison noticed it too. But they had come too far to turn back now. The team moved through the rocky terrain with practiced silence, their night vision goggles turning the moonless landscape into an eerie green world. Rodriguez took point, his instincts honed by years of special operations training. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound could signal an ambush. The village appeared quiet as they approached. Too quiet for a place that should have been bustling with late-night activity. As they reached the outer perimeter, Rodriguez spotted movement in one of the buildings. Through his scope, he could see armed figures moving around inside what appeared to be their target structure. The intelligence seemed accurate, but something still felt wrong. The placement of the guards was too obvious, their movements too casual for men who should have been on high alert. Harrison gave the signal to move in. The team split into 2 groups, with Rodriguez leading 3 men around the back, while Harrison approached from the front. As they crept closer to the building, the sound of voices became clearer. Arabic mixed with Pashto, the local dialect that Rodriguez had learned during his multiple deployments to the region. Suddenly, the night erupted in chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as automatic weapons fire erupted from every direction. The SEAL team found themselves caught in a carefully orchestrated ambush, with insurgents firing from rooftops, doorways, and concealed positions throughout the village. The intelligence had been compromised and they had walked straight into a trap. Rodriguez dove for cover as bullets whizzed past his head, striking the wall behind him and sending chunks of dried mud flying. His team members were scattered across the small courtyard, each man fighting for his life against overwhelming odds. Through his radio, he could hear Harrison calling for immediate extraction, but the pilot's response was grim. Enemy fire had damaged their helicopter, and it would be at least 30 minutes before backup could arrive. The firefight intensified as more insurgents emerged from hiding places throughout the village. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from at least 20 different positions, far more enemies than their small team could handle. He watched in horror as one of his teammates, Petty Officer Danny Chen, was hit in the shoulder and went down behind a low wall. Without hesitation, Rodriguez sprinted across the open courtyard under heavy fire to reach his wounded brother. As he dragged Chen to better cover, Rodriguez realized the full scope of their predicament. They were outnumbered at least 4-1, low on ammunition and trapped in an enemy-controlled village with no immediate hope of rescue. The Taliban had clearly been planning this ambush for weeks, possibly months, using their intelligence network to lure an American special operations team into their killing ground. But Marcus Rodriguez was not the type of man to give up easily. Born in East Los Angeles to a family of Mexican immigrants, he had joined the Navy at 18 to escape the gang violence that plagued his neighborhood. His father, a construction worker who had fought to give his children better opportunities, had taught him that sometimes a man has to stand and fight, even when the odds seem impossible. Now pinned down in a foreign desert thousands of miles from home, Rodriguez channeled that fighting spirit his father had instilled in him. He began coordinating the team's defensive positions, using hand signals to communicate with his scattered teammates. If they were going to die in this godforsaken village, they would take as many enemies with them as possible and buy precious time for any rescue attempt. The battle raged through the night, with Rodriguez and his team holding their ground against wave after wave of attacks. They moved from position to position, using their superior training and marksmanship to inflict heavy casualties on the insurgents. But their ammunition was running dangerously low, and more enemies seemed to arrive with each passing hour. Dawn brought no relief to the besieged SEAL team. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the dusty air, Rodriguez could see the true scope of the enemy forces surrounding them. Taliban fighters had taken positions on every rooftop and in every alley, turning the village into a fortress designed to trap and eliminate the American special operators. Lieutenant Harrison crawled over to Rodriguez's position, blood seeping through a makeshift bandage on his left arm. His face was grim as he delivered the news that Rodriguez had been dreading. Their radio operator, Petty Officer Mike Thompson, had been killed during the night, and their primary communications equipment had been destroyed by enemy fire. They were now completely cut off from their command structure, with no way to call for help or coordinate a rescue mission. The ammunition situation was becoming critical. Each man was down to his last few magazines, and they had already redistributed rounds twice during the night to ensure everyone could continue fighting. Rodriguez counted the remaining grenades, only 3 left between the entire team. Against at least 60 enemy fighters, their chances of survival were dropping with each passing minute. Chen, despite his wounded shoulder, had managed to set up an improvised sniper position in the upper floor of a partially collapsed building. His reports painted a dire picture. More Taliban reinforcements were arriving from the surrounding mountains, and he had spotted what appeared to be heavy weapons being moved into position. The insurgents were preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm the SEAL team's remaining defenses. Rodriguez made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Gathering his surviving teammates around him, he outlined a desperate plan. While the rest of the team prepared defensive positions in the most fortified building they could find, he would create a diversion by attacking the enemy's main concentration on the opposite side of the village. The distraction might give his brothers enough time to break through the enemy lines and reach the extraction point, where rescue helicopters could attempt a pickup. Harrison immediately protested the plan, recognizing it for what it was, a suicide mission. Rodriguez would be facing at least 30 enemies alone, with limited ammunition and no support. But Rodriguez had already made up his mind. Someone had to stay behind to buy time for the others, and as the most experienced member of the team after Harrison, he was the logical choice. The team spent precious minutes arguing about the plan, with each man volunteering to take Rodriguez's place. But Rodriguez silenced them with a look that spoke of absolute determination. He had made his choice, and nothing they could say would change his mind. These men were his brothers, and he would gladly give his life to ensure they made it home to their families. As Rodriguez prepared for his solo assault, he thought about his own family back in Los Angeles. His mother, Maria, who worked double shifts at a local hospital to support the family. His younger sister, Carmen, who was studying to become a teacher. His girlfriend, Sarah, who waited faithfully for him through each deployment, despite the constant fear and uncertainty. He pulled out a crumpled photo of Sarah from his vest pocket and stared at her smiling face for a long moment. The final preparations were made in silence. Rodriguez redistributed his remaining ammunition, keeping only what he needed for the mission ahead. He gave Harrison his personal effects, including a letter he had written to Sarah before the mission began. In it, he had tried to express feelings that had always been difficult for him to put into words. His love for her, his dreams of their future together, and his hope that she would find happiness even if he didn't make it home. Chen spotted movement in the enemy positions and signaled that the final assault was about to begin. Rodriguez knew this was his moment. He clasped hands with each of his teammates, looking them in the eyes and making them promise to get home safely. Harrison tried one last time to talk him out of the plan, but Rodriguez was already moving toward the door. The village erupted in gunfire as Rodriguez burst from the building, sprinting toward the largest concentration of enemy fighters. His sudden appearance caught the Taliban by surprise, and for a few precious seconds, their attention was completely focused on this lone American warrior charging directly at their positions. He moved like a man possessed, firing with deadly accuracy as he advanced across the open ground. Behind him, Rodriguez could hear his teammates beginning their fighting withdrawal toward the extraction point. The diversion was working, but he knew it would be short-lived. Soon the enemies would realize what was happening and split their forces to pursue his escaping brothers. He had to make every second count. Rodriguez reached the first enemy position and engaged in close-quarters combat with 3 Taliban fighters who had been using a low wall for cover. His years of hand-to-hand combat training served him well as he eliminated the threat and captured their position. From this new vantage point, he could see his teammates making progress toward the extraction zone. But they still had several hundred meters of dangerous ground to cover. The enemy response was swift and overwhelming. Automatic weapons fire converged on Rodriguez's position from every direction, forcing him to take cover behind the wall where the dead insurgents lay. Bullets chipped away at the concrete and mud structure, and he knew it wouldn't provide protection for much longer. But every minute he could hold their attention was another minute for his brothers to escape. Rodriguez fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, moving from position to position as the Taliban fighters closed in around him. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, but his determination burned brighter than ever. Through brief glimpses between firefights, he could see his teammates making steady progress toward the extraction point, and that knowledge gave him the strength to continue fighting against impossible odds. The Taliban had quickly adapted to his tactics, sending small groups to flank his position while others provided covering fire. Rodriguez found himself playing a deadly game of cat and mouse through the narrow alleys and crumbling buildings of the village. His intimate knowledge of urban combat, gained through years of training and previous deployments, was the only thing keeping him alive as enemy fighters seemed to emerge from every doorway and rooftop. During a brief lull in the fighting, Rodriguez heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. The rescue birds were finally arriving, but they would need time to locate and extract his teammates. He had to hold out just a little longer, had to keep the enemy focused on him rather than the evacuation zone. With his rifle nearly empty, he grabbed an AK-47 from a fallen insurgent and continued his fighting retreat through the village. The wound came suddenly and without warning. A Taliban sniper, positioned in a minaret overlooking the village, had been tracking Rodriguez's movements and finally found his mark. The bullet caught Rodriguez in the right thigh, sending him crashing to the ground behind a pile of rubble. Blood immediately began soaking through his combat uniform, and he could feel the strength leaving his leg. Despite the pain, Rodriguez managed to apply a tourniquet to slow the bleeding and continued fighting from his prone position. The enemy fighters, sensing his weakness, began to close in more aggressively. He could hear them calling to each other in Pashto, coordinating their final assault on his position. With only a few rounds remaining, Rodriguez prepared to make his last stand. The sound of automatic weapons fire from the direction of the extraction zone told him that his teammates had encountered resistance during their escape attempt. His heart sank as he realized that his sacrifice might not be enough to save them. The Taliban had apparently held back a reserve force to intercept any Americans trying to reach the landing zone. Everything he had endured, all the pain and blood, might have been for nothing, but Rodriguez was not ready to give up. Ignoring the searing pain in his leg, he forced himself to his feet and began moving toward the sound of the firefight. If his brothers were in trouble, he would find a way to help them, even if it killed him. Using buildings and walls for support, he hobbled through the village, following the sounds of combat that grew louder with each painful step. As he rounded a corner, Rodriguez saw the situation that awaited him. His 3 surviving teammates were pinned down in a small compound about 200 meters from the helicopter landing zone. At least 15 Taliban fighters had them surrounded, and the rescue helicopters were circling overhead, unable to land under the heavy enemy fire. The pilots were waiting for the ground to be cleared, but that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Rodriguez assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a professional warrior. The enemy fighters were so focused on the surrounded SEALs that they had left their own flanks exposed. If he could reach the high ground in a nearby building, he might be able to create enough chaos to allow the helicopters to attempt a landing. It would require him to cross open ground while wounded, but it was the only chance any of them had. Loading his last magazine into the captured AK-47, Rodriguez began his final assault. The Taliban fighters were completely surprised when gunfire erupted from behind them, and several were cut down before they could react. Rodriguez had reached the building and was climbing the stairs to the roof. each step in agony as his wounded leg threatened to give out beneath him. From the rooftop, Rodriguez had a commanding view of the entire battle. He could see his teammates below, desperately fighting to break out of their encirclement. He could see the rescue helicopters hovering just out of range, their pilots waiting for an opportunity to land. And he could see the Taliban fighters scrambling to respond to this new threat from an unexpected direction. Rodriguez opened fire with everything he had left, his shots carefully aimed to maximize their impact. Enemy fighters fell one by one as he worked his way through the magazine, each round finding its target with the precision that had made him one of the Navy's finest marksmen. The distraction was working. His teammates were beginning to break free from their surrounded position and move toward the landing zone. But Rodriguez's elevated position also made him an obvious target. Enemy fire began to converge on the rooftop, forcing him to take cover behind a low wall that surrounded the building's edge. Bullets whistled overhead and struck the concrete around him, sending chips and dust flying in all directions. He knew it was only a matter of time before one of them found its mark. The second wound came as Rodriguez was changing position to get a better angle on the enemy below. A burst of automatic weapons fire from a nearby rooftop caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing against the wall. Blood poured from the wound and his left arm went completely numb. But still he fought on, using his right hand to steady his rifle as he continued engaging the enemy. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, Rodriguez watched as his teammates finally broke free from the enemy encirclement and began their sprint toward the landing zone. The lead helicopter was already beginning its descent, its door gunners laying down suppressive fire to clear the area. Victory was within reach, but Rodriguez knew he would not be joining them on the ride home. Rodriguez watched with grim satisfaction as the first helicopter touched down and his teammates scrambled aboard. Lieutenant Harrison was the last aboard, and Rodriguez could see him scanning the rooftops, desperately searching for any sign of his missing brother. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the chaos of the battlefield, and Rodriguez raised his rifle in a final salute before Harrison was pulled into the aircraft by the crew chief. The helicopter lifted off just as more Taliban reinforcements arrived in the village. Rodriguez had accomplished his mission. His teammates were safe and heading home to their families. Now came the hardest part of all, accepting that his own story was about to end in this remote Afghan village, thousands of miles from everyone he loved. With his ammunition exhausted and his body failing from blood loss, Rodriguez prepared to make his final stand. The Taliban fighters below had located his position and were already climbing the stairs to the rooftop. He could hear their voices growing closer, their footsteps echoing in the stairwell. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. Rodriguez thought about his father's words from years ago, spoken during one of their rare, quiet moments together on the construction site where young Marcus had worked summers. A man's true measure isn't in how he lives, but in what he's willing to die for. At the time, those words had seemed like abstract philosophy, but now they carried the weight of absolute truth. The first Taliban fighter appeared at the top of the stairs, his rifle raised and ready. Rodriguez was slumped against the wall, his weapons empty, his body broken but his spirit undefeated. The insurgent barked something in Pashto, probably ordering him to surrender, but Rodriguez simply stared back with the defiant gaze of a warrior who had given everything for his brothers. What happened next would become the subject of legend among the special operations community. Instead of simply executing their helpless prisoner, the Taliban fighters seemed to recognize something in Rodriguez's demeanor that gave them pause. Perhaps it was the respect that one warrior shows to another, or perhaps they were simply curious about the man who had single-handedly held off their entire force. The leader of the group, a grizzled veteran with scars marking his weathered face, approached Rodriguez slowly. He spoke in broken English, asking why the American had stayed behind when his friends had escaped. Rodriguez met his gaze steadily and replied with simple honesty, "They are my brothers." Those 3 words seemed to resonate with the Taliban commander, who nodded slowly as if he understood something fundamental about the man before him. In the tribal culture of Afghanistan, loyalty to one's brothers was the highest virtue, worth more than life itself. Rodriguez had demonstrated that same code of honor. Even in the face of certain death, the Taliban fighters bound Rodriguez's wounds with rough field dressings, not out of mercy but because they wanted their prize prisoner alive for interrogation and propaganda purposes. They dragged him down from the rooftop and loaded him into a battered pickup truck, beginning a journey that would take him deep into the mountains where Taliban leadership maintained their hidden strongholds. As the truck bounced along rough mountain roads, Rodriguez drifted in and out of consciousness from blood loss and pain. In his lucid moments, he could see the barren landscape of Afghanistan rolling past, the same mountains and valleys where countless warriors had fought and died throughout history. He was now part of that ancient tradition, another soldier whose fate would be decided in these unforgiving peaks. The Taliban compound where they took Rodriguez was a maze of caves and bunkers carved into the mountainside, invisible from the air and easily defendable against ground assault. It had been a sanctuary for insurgent leaders throughout the long war, a place where they could plan operations and hold valuable prisoners without fear of American retaliation. Rodriguez was thrown into a small cell carved from solid rock, barely large enough for a man to lie down. The walls wept moisture constantly, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. A small opening near the ceiling provided the only light, casting everything in perpetual twilight. It was a place designed to break a man's spirit through isolation and despair. But Rodriguez's spirit had been forged in the crucible of Los Angeles street life and tempered by years of military service. He had survived boot camp at Great Lakes Naval Training Center, endured the hell of SEAL training at Coronado, and proven himself in combat across multiple deployments. This cave would not be the thing that broke him. The interrogations began almost immediately. Taliban intelligence officers, some speaking fluent English, took turns questioning Rodriguez about American troop strengths, future operations, and the identities of local informants. They used every technique in their arsenal: sleep deprivation, temperature extremes, psychological pressure, and physical abuse. But Rodriguez gave them nothing beyond his name, rank, and service number. Days turned into weeks as Rodriguez endured the systematic torture designed to break his will. His captors seemed genuinely puzzled by his resistance, unable to understand how a man could endure such suffering without breaking. They had broken other prisoners much more quickly, but something about Rodriguez's determination seemed to frustrate their every effort. During the long hours of solitude between interrogation sessions, Rodriguez kept his sanity by retreating into memories of home. He relived every moment he had shared with Sarah, from their first meeting at a coffee shop near the naval base to their last goodbye before his deployment. He remembered family dinners with his parents and sister, the smell of his mother's cooking filling their small apartment, the sound of his father's laughter echoing through the rooms. The physical wounds from the firefight gradually healed, but new injuries accumulated daily as his captors grew more frustrated with his silence. Rodriguez's body bore the evidence of their anger: broken ribs, blackened eyes, burns from cigarettes and heated metal. Yet somehow his spirit remained intact, sustained by the knowledge that his sacrifice had allowed his teammates to return home safely. Months passed in the mountain prison as Rodriguez fought a different kind of war, a battle for his mind and soul against the relentless efforts of his captors to break him. The seasons changed from the brutal heat of summer to the bitter cold of winter, and still he endured, sustained by an inner strength that amazed even his enemies. During this time, Rodriguez began to notice patterns in the daily routine of the compound. Guards changed shifts at specific times, supply convoys arrived on predictable schedules, and the leadership maintained regular communications with other Taliban cells throughout the region. Despite his weakened condition, the tactical part of his mind continued to function, cataloging information that might prove useful if an opportunity for escape ever presented itself. The Taliban had declared Rodriguez dead to the outside world, releasing propaganda videos that showed his empty gear and claimed he had been killed during the firefight in the village. Back home, his family had received the devastating news that he was missing in action, presumed dead. Sarah had attended a memorial service at the naval base, accepting a folded flag while fighting back tears that seemed to flow endlessly. But Rodriguez was very much alive, though barely recognizable as the confident SEAL who had led his team into that fatal ambush so many months ago. His body had been reduced to skin and bones by the meager rations and constant abuse. His hair had grown long and wild, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had stared into the abyss of human cruelty and somehow maintained his sanity. One day, A new prisoner was brought to the compound, a British journalist who had been captured while investigating Taliban activities in a nearby province. The man, James Mitchell, was thrown into a cell adjacent to Rodriguez's, and their whispered conversations through the rock walls became Rodriguez's first real human contact in months. Mitchell brought news from the outside world, including reports that American forces were still searching for Rodriguez, despite officially listing him as deceased. The journalist's presence seemed to energize Rodriguez in ways he hadn't expected. Having someone to talk to, someone who understood English and could relate to Western values, reminded him that there was still a world beyond these cave walls worth fighting to return to. Mitchell, in turn, was amazed by Rodriguez's resilience and drew strength from the SEAL's unbreakable spirit. Together, they began to plan an escape attempt. Mitchell had noticed that the guards were less vigilant during the pre-dawn hours, and Rodriguez had identified a weakness in the compound's security during supply deliveries. It would be incredibly dangerous. If caught, they would certainly be executed rather than returned to their cells. But both men had reached the point where death seemed preferable to continued captivity. The opportunity came during a particularly cold winter night, when a fierce snowstorm had reduced visibility to mere feet. Rodriguez had managed to work loose a stone in his cell wall over many weeks of patient effort, creating an opening just large enough for a malnourished man to squeeze through. The plan was simple but desperate: escape during the guard change, overpower the sentries if necessary, and make their way down the mountain before their absence was discovered. Rodriguez went first, his weakened body barely able to fit through the narrow opening he had created. The rough stone scraped against his ribs and back, opening fresh wounds, but he forced himself through by sheer willpower. Mitchell followed, and together they crept through the compound like ghosts, avoiding the few guards who remained alert in the bitter cold. They had made it to the outer perimeter when disaster struck. A guard returning early from his round spotted movement in the shadows and raised the alarm. Lights blazed throughout the compound as Taliban fighters scrambled to respond to the escape attempt. Rodriguez grabbed Mitchell's arm and they ran desperately toward the tree line, their bare feet slipping on the icy ground as shouts and gunfire erupted behind them. The chase that followed was a nightmare of pain and desperation. Rodriguez's weakened legs could barely carry him, and Mitchell, who lacked any military training, stumbled repeatedly in the darkness. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer as their captors organized a systematic search using flashlights and torches to penetrate the storm. They had covered perhaps a mile when Mitchell collapsed from exhaustion, his body finally succumbing to months of abuse and the brutal cold of the Afghan winter. Rodriguez tried to help him up, but the journalist was beyond continuing. With tears freezing on his cheeks, Rodriguez made the agonizing decision to leave Mitchell behind and continue alone, knowing that stopping would mean death or recapture for both of them. The rest of that night passed in a blur of pain and determination as Rodriguez pushed his battered body beyond all reasonable limits. He stumbled through snowdrifts, slipped on icy rocks, and fought off the hypothermia that threatened to drag him into unconsciousness. Behind him, the sounds of the search party gradually faded as the storm covered his tracks and confusion reigned among his pursuers. As dawn broke over the mountains, Rodriguez found himself in a valley he didn't recognize. With no idea how far he had traveled or in which direction, his feet were bloody and frostbitten, his body was shutting down from cold and exhaustion, and he had no food, water, or proper clothing to sustain him in the harsh environment. But for the first time in months he was free, and that knowledge gave him the strength to keep moving. The next several days blurred together in a haze of survival and desperation. Rodriguez followed valleys that led generally eastward, toward what he hoped were areas controlled by coalition forces. He found shelter in abandoned buildings and caves, scrounged for food among the sparse vegetation, and avoided all human contact for fear of being captured again. His training in survival, evasion, resistance, and escape finally paid dividends as Rodriguez gradually made his way across the hostile landscape. He moved only at night, hid during the day, and used every skill he had learned to remain invisible to the Taliban search parties that continued to hunt for him throughout the region. After 6 days of desperate flight through the Afghan mountains, Rodriguez stumbled into a forward operating base manned by Marines from the 2nd Battalion. The young Marine on guard duty initially thought he was looking at a ghost, a wild-haired, emaciated figure emerging from the darkness, speaking English but looking like he had risen from the dead. It took several minutes of verification before anyone could believe that this broken man was actually Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, officially listed as killed in action months earlier. The medical team at the base immediately rushed Rodriguez to the field hospital, where doctors worked frantically to stabilize his condition. He was severely malnourished, suffering from multiple infections and showing signs of extensive torture and abuse. His weight had dropped from 185 pounds to barely 130, and his body bore the scars of countless interrogation sessions. But somehow, miraculously, he was alive. Word of Rodriguez's survival spread quickly through the military command structure, eventually reaching the highest levels of Pentagon leadership. The man who had been posthumously recommended for the Medal of Honor was suddenly very much alive, though forever changed by his ordeal. His story of survival against impossible odds became an inspiration to troops throughout the theater of operations. The journey home was surreal for Rodriguez, who had spent so many months dreaming of this moment that reality seemed almost impossible to accept. The military transport aircraft that carried him to Germany for advanced medical treatment felt like a luxury liner compared to the cave where he had been imprisoned. Hot food, clean clothes, and medical care were privileges he had forgotten could exist. But the physical healing was only the beginning of Rodriguez's long journey back to the world of the living. Months of torture and isolation had left psychological wounds that would take years to heal. He suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, experienced frequent nightmares, and struggled with survivor's guilt over the death of James Mitchell, the British journalist who had helped plan their escape but didn't survive to see freedom. The homecoming at Naval Air Station North Island was emotional beyond description. Sarah, who had mourned Rodriguez's death for months and was just beginning to rebuild her life, received the impossible phone call that changed everything. The man she loved, the man she had buried in her heart, was alive and coming home. When she saw him walking slowly down the aircraft ramp, supported by medical personnel, she hardly recognized the skeletal figure who bore only a passing resemblance to the strong, confident SEAL she remembered. Rodriguez's family gathered around him with a mixture of joy and heartbreak. His mother, Maria, wept openly as she held her son, feeling the sharp bones beneath his skin and seeing the haunted look in his eyes. His father, the tough construction worker who had taught him about courage and sacrifice, struggled to find words adequate for this moment. His sister Carmen had grown up during his absence, finishing her teaching degree and starting a career, but she still saw him as the protective older brother who had always watched over her. The medal ceremony took place 6 months later, after Rodriguez had gained back much of his weight and begun the long process of psychological recovery. The president himself presented the Medal of Honor, reading the citation that detailed Rodriguez's extraordinary heroism during that firefight in the Afghan village. The words spoke of selfless courage, devotion to duty, and willingness to sacrifice his life for his teammates, values that had sustained Rodriguez through his darkest hours. But Rodriguez himself felt conflicted about the honor. In his mind, he was no hero. He was simply a man who had done what any SEAL would do for his brothers. The real heroes, he believed, were the men who had made it home safely because of his sacrifice, and James Mitchell, who had died in the snow during their escape attempt. The medal was beautiful, but it felt like it belonged to someone else, someone worthier than the broken man who now struggled with nightmares and panic attacks. The transition back to civilian life proved more challenging than any mission Rodriguez had ever undertaken. The Navy offered him a medical retirement with full benefits, recognizing that his physical and psychological injuries made him unfit for continued military service. At 30 years old, he faced the daunting prospect of building an entirely new life outside the military structure that had defined him for over a decade. Sarah stood by him through the difficult months of readjustment. Though their relationship was forever changed by his experiences, the confident, outgoing man she had fallen in love with had been replaced by someone quieter, more introspective, carrying burdens that she could never fully understand. They attended counseling together, worked through the trauma as a team, and slowly rebuilt their connection on a foundation of shared strength rather than shared innocence. Rodriguez eventually found his calling as an advocate for prisoners of war and veterans suffering from PTSD. He spoke at military bases and veteran organizations, sharing his story not to glorify warfare but to help others understand that survival was possible even in the darkest circumstances. His message was simple but powerful. No matter how hopeless the situation might seem, the human spirit could endure and ultimately triumph over evil. Years later, Rodriguez would look back on his ordeal as a defining moment that revealed both the worst and best of human nature. He had seen the depths of cruelty that men could inflict upon each other, but he had also experienced the bonds of brotherhood that made such sacrifice worthwhile. His teammates had returned home safely, raised families, and lived full lives because of his decision to stay behind in that Afghan village. The scars would never fully heal, and the nightmares would never completely disappear. But Marcus Rodriguez had accomplished something that would resonate through military history. He had demonstrated that the warrior's code of honor was not just an abstract ideal, but a living principle worth any sacrifice. In a world that often seemed to have lost its way, he had proven that some men would still choose duty over safety, brotherhood over survival, and honor over life itself. Rodriguez married Sarah in a small ceremony attended by his surviving teammates, their presence a reminder of the bonds forged in combat that would last a lifetime. He never returned to active duty, but he never stopped being a SEAL in the ways that truly mattered. The man who had been buried beneath dust and blood in an Afghan village had risen again, not as a symbol of war's glory, but as a testament to the unbreakable strength of the human spirit when tested by ultimate adversity.